we don't want to make this run late. So we're going to go ahead and start, and other people can join us as they can. This is Elizabeth Roaring. I am the Engagement League for NOAA's Sea Grant Program. Joining me here is Nancy Beller-Sims, who's with the Climate Program Office. And we also have Kim Klockow, who will in just a moment tell you her new title and role. I did want to say that everybody on the call is on mute. If you have questions, please enter them into the question menu. That should be, generally it's to the right on your computer unless you've moved it somewhere. We will be addressing those. We will have time for question and answer right after each presentation, and then we'll have a longer time for Q&A at the end. So feel free to type in your question at any time. We will get to them in the order that they come in. If we run out of time for questions, then we'll share your questions with the others, with the presenters, and make sure that we can get the answers for you. So with that, I am going to turn this over to Kim. Kim, if you could just do a little, an updated background of you and your position, and then introduce the speakers, that would be great.
That sounds great. Thank you, Elizabeth, and welcome everybody to the call, our second installment. We're very pleased today to be bringing you the two speakers I'll introduce in just a moment. As a brief introduction to me, I was with Nancy and Elizabeth at headquarters working in the NOAA Office of Weather and Air Quality, and I have since recently transitioned out to work more closely with the research community in a NOAA Lab and Cooperative Institute. I'm a STIMS Cooperative Institute for Mesoscale Meteorological Studies research scientist working at the National Severe Storms Lab, and I will be a societal applications coordinator with them, which means that I'm going to be helping to coordinate the social scientific research efforts that are going on here and connect them with headquarters and also just help participate in the research activities themselves. I'm very excited about the chance to return to the NOAA Research Network in this position. So with that, I will pass this along to our presenters. So today we're going to have Mike Ignatow, who is a researcher at the University of Maryland. He, I think, Mike, you can probably give us some updated information about your new position. I know that you've recently transitioned as well. But he's going to be presenting today about the issue of complacency and alarming. And this is a piece of work that he and his team did as part of the Vortex Southeast campaign. And this opportunity is funded through especially managed through the National Severe Storms Lab that come through the weather arm of OAR. And so we're very excited to have some of this research finally coming out and to share those results with you. The other presenter today is Rachel Hogan-Carr, who's from the Nurture Nature Center. And she has conducted some research that she'll explain she'll be presenting today some of the research that was part of a grant opportunity through OWAC and in partnership with the Weather Service. It was the Social Science and Weather Research Funding Opportunity. The research has multiple legs though, so she's since branched this with multiple lines of funding to do a whole lot of great things, and she'll be talking about communicating uncertainty information, especially for flooding. So without further ado, I'll pass it back to you, Elizabeth, to get going with our speakers.
Great, thank you so much. So Mike, I'm going to go ahead and make you the presenter. I see that you are muted right now, that you're self-muted, so you'll need to unmute in order for us to hear you.
Hello, everyone.
Excellent, thank you.
Just to confirm, do you see my speaker notes or do you see my regular notes?
We see the speaker notes as well.
And let me do this. How's that?
Perfect.
So hello and thank you for having me. Thanks to Kim, thanks to Elizabeth. We really appreciate it. I'd also like to specifically thank Eric Rasmussen and the Vortex SE team for making this research possible. This research was done while I was at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Response to Terrorism out of the University of Maryland. Dr. Brooke Fisher-Liu was my postdoc advisor there. She is wonderful and an amazing researcher. And the rest of the research team was Holly Ann Roberts, who is a talented researcher and project manager, and Reese Lynn, very gifted grad student. So if they're on, I hope they can hear and maybe they can chime in too if needed. So the long and short of the reason we did this research is we're very interested in how complacency as a whole concept really played into this idea of if people do or do not respond to tornadic warnings. And it makes a lot of sense actually that we would do that from kind of a the type of center that I was at the time, because there's not a lot of warning with tornadoes, just like there's not a lot of warning with certain types of negative kinetic events. So there's actually a lot of parallels there going on. And I think the weather community is really has some opportunity for some great back and forth exchange. So just to put a little context around this, the southeastern U.S. was interesting for a number of reasons. First, a quarter of all tornadoes that happen annually occur in the southeastern U.S. And we know that most of the fatalities that do occur from tornadoes do occur in that region. So there's some unique elements in the southeastern United States that leads to distinct risk communication challenges. And that's really what we wanted to dive into. Okay. So this project specifically looked at the concerns that false alarms and how they manifest in an actual or anticipated event. Insofar as, does the presence of false alarms create like this cry wolf effect? If you warn people over and over and over again, do they tend to, withdraw and stop responding to that information? So we aim then to better understand how these complacency in general, if it exists, to what extent it impacts these messaging outcomes. Okay, so that was kind of like a quick dive into how we set it up. Some relevant definitions that we want to cover here. We use tornado alert as an expression throughout a lot of this research. We noticed a lot of people struggled with the difference between watch and warning, and those things kind of got muddled in a lot of people's heads. So we collectively refer to tornado watches and warnings as alerts. Mobile home, for the purposes of this research, is a mobile or manufactured home. It's a dwelling that could be placed or moved, and it's often lower cost, lower weather resistance than fixed housing things. We pass no judgment on if these should or should not be there, merely that they are. For the southeastern United States, we included Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Florida, and Tennessee. Majority of the findings we're going to focus on, cut those into kind of further regions of the South-South, the Mid-South, and the North-South. And we'll talk about that as we go. And then complacency. We wanted to really operationalize this. So previous research describes complacency as repeated threat warnings and experiences, like those from high probability, low impact events. Some of you might call them black swans. Individual capabilities to prepare for those events, individual demographics, and the individual risk assessments on expected damages. So complacency is the confluence of those four factors coming together in their willingness to respond or not respond to that information. How we approach this work. So to give this idea of complacency, we're going to focus mainly on the survey research that was done. In addition to the survey research, we did a number of focus groups. We actually ended up doing 11 focus groups throughout the southeastern U.S., focusing on Alabama, North Carolina, and Louisville, Kentucky for those locations, with the most focus groups being conducted in Alabama, with additional focus group being conducted there specifically just on mobile home residents. The survey research itself, we focused on the southeastern U.S. as a whole, and we took a total of 4 surveys, and we evaluated 3,000 people who are in what we consider fixed homes. These are non-mobile homes. These can be apartment buildings. These can be standalone structures. These can be row homes, but they're fixed. They have foundations or slabs, things that are a little bit more kind of robust than the mobile homes we previously described. And then we actually got a sample of 1,000 mobile home residents, which was no small doing. The surveys that we administered took approximately 26 minutes. For the mobile home component, they did require current mobile home residency. We did not go with people who had previously lived in mobile We were slightly female skewed, and we were racially balanced through the U.S. Okay.
Hey, Mike.
Yes.
This is Elizabeth. We just had a question, and I was wondering if you could address it because it has to do with complacency. Someone asked, I see how you're measuring response to complacency, but I don't know what complacency means in this case. Is that, sorry, hang on, is that people don't respond to the threats or warnings?
So that's a good question, and that's one of the big punchlines we find here. So we see how complacency is operationalized here as the confluence of these four factors. But that manifest of complacency is generally assessed by non-response. And this is where things get really muddy, and we will cover this a little more in depth as we go on, but it bears mention now, is when we say non-response, a lot of times people who don't take action, do not respond to any type of alert, are considered complacent. And this was based on kind of a lot of literature and setup that we encountered, and we were interested in, is complacency actually the best framing for this mentality? Because once you put them into a complacency mental framework, it has some implications about shifting responsibility, how messaging structure adapts, and it doesn't necessarily account as much for capability and ability as we would like. You know, I'm sure a number of people in the audience work pretty closely with first responders, and you're very aware of all of the you know, interactions you get with functional access needs and kind of specialty populations throughout this. So when we say complacency here, what I very specifically mean is these four factors manifesting in non-response behavior.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Okay. So just to briefly go into some of our initial findings. When we looked at what is a false alarm, we noticed that there was a few groups that kind of shook out of this research. And we did this through an open-coded scheme, and we asked people very simply what they felt a false alarm was. There was this whole interaction of, you know, do false alarms lead to complacency, that kind of repeated warning of rare events. So we just asked people simply, what do they think it means? And we noticed four distinct groups. The first group we called the inexperienced. These people, who we consider inexperienced, felt that a false alarm meant no tornado. They're focused again and again on this idea that there was no tornado, a tornado is not going to occur. And these people also self-reported having very little actual tornado experience in their life. They self-reported having 0 to 3 tornadic events affect them directly. And these people felt that a false alarm meant that fraudulent information was introduced at some point in the process. They focused on phrases like fake or faked and false tornado. And that leads us into this second group of skeptics, where they kind of had this mentality that there was a lie that somehow got involved, or that something had been misclassified. There was a lot of focus on things like misidentification of dust clouds, misidentification of information. And then we get into the experienced cautious. And we'll come back to the benign confused, but I want to do this out of order for a reason here. As we get into the experienced cautious, these are the people who had self-reported the highest amounts of previous tornado experience. The majority of people in this category had experienced 5+ tornadic events that they felt directly influenced their life, and we asked that simply by saying how many tornadoes have directly influenced you. Let them fill in a response. And they focused on that signs dissipated, that rotation may have been indicated but did not manifest in a touchdown. So they had this very kind of high level understanding of you know, kind of what these false alarms might actually mean, and very much trended towards correctly identifying the elements of how false alarms are assessed throughout the kind of weather community. The benign confused are people who generally lived in the north-south. This is the Maryland, North Carolina, Northern Virginia region. And they kind of, when they received information, they didn't know what to do with it. They didn't feel that they had a history of understanding tornado response. They didn't feel they had an understanding of what some of those messages mean, like kind of shelter in place, go to a safe space, some of those things. They didn't quite have that. But there was a silver lining insofar as we noticed that there was a strong geographic relationship here between these four groups, and that the experienced cautious clustered very strongly in what we call the South-South, the Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, the kind of hard-hit zone that experiences the most of the southeastern U.S. tornadoes. And you get more into the inexperienced, the benign, confused, and the skeptics as you move north and kind of into lower risk tornado areas. So we noticed that there was a strong geographic component that played into this. And that it seems that people who need information, at least in understanding what a false alarm is, were in a fairly decent place. Okay? Then we were interested, well, what about emotion? Does emotion play into the understanding of false alarms and complacency? So what we did here was we did a kind of it's a two-step clustering process. And for the other quants in the area, if you don't know two-step clustering, just think of it like a simplified k-means clustering where you don't set the number of groups on the way in. You can let it free form its groups. For any of the geospatial people, it's kind of like a Jenks, but not exactly like a Jenks breaks. And long story short, we found three groups that kind of broke out from emotionality that related to these previous groups. And we had people who had low negative emotion to false alarms, but they were very willing to prepare and they had a lot of experience. So this kind of matched up with our previous experienced cautious, and there was a lot of overlap between these. We had moderate negative emotion response, and negative emotion response here is characterized by people who experienced anger, frustration, depression, in response to receiving false alarms. But they were still quite willing to prepare for these events, and they did note that they had a significant amount of experience. And these people tended to break down mainly still in the experienced cautious and a little bit into the skeptics. The final group, the high negative emotion to false alarms, high willingness to prepare, high experience. These were mainly our skeptics. So as emotionality went up, there was an element of skepticism that increased. But all groups that clustered effectively were extremely willing to prepare regardless of receiving false alarms, which is important to notice. What we did see is that the skeptics, or not the skeptics, the inexperienced and the benign confused, the people who had the lowest amount of tornado experience, they did not have any consistent behavior that could be discerned or broken out into its own cluster, which is kind of interesting because that means their emotional response was across the spectrum. Their willingness to prepare was across the spectrum. And the only thing that linked them was that lack of experience. So what we see from this is that in the communities that matter, and I don't mean to marginalize communities in that way, but bear with me for the sake of example. In the communities that experience the most events, people are generally well informed. They generally are willing to prepare. And even if they don't have a great emotional response, false alarms don't seem to hurt them. So we can get away with some of those higher warning levels in the places like Alabama, things like that, where they're experiencing a lot of these kind of tornadic events. So we looked at, maybe it's to do with false alarms, maybe it's to do with their emotionality. And we thought, well, geez, maybe it's just the way that they're receiving information. And when we looked at the differences between mobile homes, region, fixed homes, we found that most people generally get their information the same way. Most people are relying on traditional media for their alerts. There's a huge amount of television. That scrolling ticker is kind of the alert that pops up at the bottom of the screen. Social media is making a stronger and stronger push. It has finally arrived. My colleague Holly Roberts always said, the social media days aren't upcoming, they are here. And the text alert service actually seems to be making an impact. So the other nice thing you'll notice is that if you look at these numbers, these add up to well over 100%. And that's a good thing, because that means not only are people receiving these messages, they're receiving redundancy of message. And we know from previous research, particularly by Liu et al., that multiple message reinforcement is key to getting people on board with these things. So we need to keep pushing some of these other media sources and these other channels to get that response rate up. Now, when we look down at source, the most striking number that comes out here is the local meteorologist. And we explore this a little more on subsequent slides. Nearly a half of people across the southeastern U.S. in fixed and mobile homes rely very heavily on their local meteorologist for their tornadic information. And that's an opportunity that I think we can really capitalize on as we begin to rely more heavily on strong partnerships with local communities and kind of the evolving role of meteorologists throughout knowing how we can work with our communities better to warn, is really kind of playing out those local kind of partnerships, because they are quite important for people finding out information. By and large, the local meteorologist outweighed almost the next three most influential kind of sources based on frequency. Okay. So we thought, okay, we looked at how people receive information, their emotionality towards it, is it false alarms? We thought, well, geez, maybe it has something to do with how much people know about storms themselves. And we ran this through a linear regression, and we found that, geez, knowledge does pretty strongly predict response to tornadoes. We see about 28% of the variance can be explained through this type of analysis. The things that we asked them about are, we combined a number of surveys that exist throughout the NOAA website series on just kind of different earth science, storms, how tornadoes form, what is a safe space, where can you go? And we pulled a number of those kind of instruments and we gave them to people across these populations, and we noticed that there actually wasn't a big difference based on housing type. And you know, you might think that the mobile home community, which traditionally is a little bit lower socioeconomic status, may have had lower access to education, but that wasn't the case in this respect. But you'll do notice that we had two more measures down there: perceived self-efficacy and perceived susceptibility. And here we see that, particularly with susceptibility, the mobile home crowd starts to differentiate a little bit. And they tend to think that they actually are at a bit higher risk, and they tend to be aware of that risk. And that's something to kind of pay attention to, because they have this awareness that they are in an inadequate structure. Okay. So kind of jiving off that idea of like, okay, we realize that there are differences, but it's not knowledge alone. We ask people very simply, do you or do you not respond to warnings, and where were you when you received your last warning? And we see that actually most people do respond to warnings across the entire region. And these numbers were trending geographically. As you went further south into higher risk areas, response rates did go up. As you went kind of further north, those response rates dropped slightly. It wasn't enough to report as significant statistically, but it is enough to kind of bear mention and keep in mind that if you're in a high risk area, your population is a little bit more in tune with it. And what we see is a lot of people are home when they receive messages, either mobile home residents or fixed home residents. That's the primary location where they are. But we do note that work and school are not insignificant places, nor the transportation between the two of them. We see that you know, about a sixth of the time people are being caught in these more transient locations. And that matters more than we expected, because when we looked at what actions people took when they received a warning, so we looked at all those people who said, did you respond to a warning? Yes. Where were you? We see that there's huge differences in how people can respond to information. And this kind of really starts driving home that mobile home kind of additional risk that we've intuitively known and kind of discussed. And you've seen some of the work by Ashley et al., and you've seen and some of the work by you know, a number of other scholars. And it gets kind of interesting because even if you just look at this wall of numbers and you just look at FH for fixed home, MH for mobile home by location, and you just see where the blanks are, we see that mobile home residents disproportionately do not have the number of response options that fixed home residents do across their places they receive warnings, particularly at work. And we have some theories on this. We weren't able to collect additional data to bear it out, but what I suspect is happening here is that mobile home residents, generally because of that decreased socioeconomic status, are in jobs where they're not in a position to take time off, and they're probably hourly. And we saw this a bit with kind of Hurricane Katrina when people were asked why they didn't evacuate. A number of people, kind of communicated this over and over again, and I'm paraphrasing, that it wasn't a sure thing that the hurricane was coming through, but people knew that if they weren't at home to receive their assistance check, if they were on social assistance, or if they weren't able to make it to work to conduct their hours, they knew they wouldn't make rent. They knew they wouldn't afford that next mortgage payment. So we see that this group of people, kind of that socioeconomic crunch, is really, really driving a significant amount of inability to respond. And that's a pretty important and powerful thing that we should pay attention to, is how can we create more opportunities for them to either respond safely or respond differently in these different ways. So kind of just, this is the final bit of data, and then I'm going to get into some conclusions to not make this too long. We had a lot of things going on here. I talked to you about previous experience. We talked about, kind of how people receive information, what they, how confident they are in their ability to do information, what kind of actions they take. What does that all mean together? So we put all these factors into a structural equation model. And if you look on the left side model, we see that we can explain when people take action about half the time, and it's really strongly driven by their individual characteristics, particularly how likely they think they are to be affected by a tornado and how concerned they are about that impact. Their lived experiences, have they been around tornadoes before, and if they're receiving good information. And that will explain a huge amount of if they're going to take action or not, and their confidence in their ability to take that action effectively. But also remember that we talked about that influence of local meteorologists, and how does that kind of change the story? Because we don't have the ability to change people's lived experience. We can't put people safely in exposure to more tornadoes. We can't make them more worried. We can't change some of those fundamental things. So we added in meteorologist trust, which was a measure we collected as kind of, how confident are you in your local meteorologist to give you true, accurate information. And that blew so many things out of the water. We still see that information source quality or quantity, is extremely relevant. We still see that those lived experiences and individual characteristics matter, but meteorologist trust basically has the influence of almost all of them combined. So we really, really need to work with our message crafting with local meteorologists, because this is our avenue. This is our way that we can heavily and productively impact people's behaviors in response to these tornadic events. Okay, so just to kind of sum up, false alarm rate, complacency, these things don't seem to be a big fear. What we do see is that there's kind of this element of learned helplessness, and we're seeing this with mobile home residents. They don't always seem to have the opportunity or the capability to take correct, responsive, and protective actions. And that's really kind of putting them in an even higher risk pool than just having the housing that they have would normally do. And we see that location matters, and as we get closer to these tornadic epicenters, that we're seeing more and more that people actually are figuring out what to do. So the thing that we need to focus on there isn't necessarily getting those people knowledge, just spooling them up faster. So it's kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. In some of the more kind of less influenced areas or less tornado impacted areas, we have to do more foundational training But in the areas that are really getting hit hard, we just have to focus on making it quicker, which makes our lives a little bit easier. So, this kind of leads towards this whole point of, is complacency the right word? When we know that non-response is frankly not always because people don't want to. We know that sometimes people can't. When we go back and we look at how people took actions, not all of these actions are productive actions in line with NOAA prescribed response. We see that a lot of people are very focused on contacting their friends and family. They're going outside, they're looking at the storm, they're trying to view that storm through a window, get some kind of visual confirmation. And a significant amount of the population is relying on faith, and they're integrating faith into their tornado response, and they're integrating prayer and, kind of some of these different faith-based responses in. So we need to, as practitioners and researchers, be aware that people are responding, but they may not be taking the response that we want. But that doesn't mean they're not doing anything. So we need to work kind of, meet them where they are, not force them to meet us where we want them to be, and work in ways that we can bring those actions more online. And that may mean reaching out to local faith-based communities to kind of get the message out, working with those local meteorologists and kind of slowly shifting some of these behaviors to be a little more in line with what we're hoping for. Okay? The one thing that I do want to drive home before we conclude, when we talk about protective actions, there's a huge knowledge gap. When we asked mobile home residents where should they seek shelter, they always say in the bathroom, ground floor room without windows. And we know that a lot of NOAA prescribed behavior, if you're in a kind of a house that's in the class of mobile homes, that isn't actually correct. We asked people who were in fixed homes, what should they do if they were in a mobile home? And no one got this. Nobody knew that mobile home structures, there is no safe space inside. There's a huge training gap here for what we can do in providing information to people, because though they seem to have a pretty good knowledge on tornado and tornado response and how they can work with it, particularly in those high tornado areas, we're missing a fundamental behavior that is not being well communicated to people. And this is a huge gap where we can kind of start filling. Okay, so that just kind of says that protective actions are not universally well communicated. There's some work we can do here. And residents are extremely reliant on local meteorologists. So that's probably a good mechanism we can use to fill that gap. And the response rate overall is pretty good. Even on just self-recall, we see that, about 2/3 of the population responds to tornado watches warning throughout the entire southeastern U.S. And that number definitely goes up as we head into more affected areas. So, we're seeing a fairly high response rate. So there is work to be done here, but the challenge is not insurmountable. And we're actually in, I think, a better position than a lot of people realized. And there's some very direct, simple steps that we can take to move forward. So that being said, thank you very much. Thanks again to my team, and I would love to hear any and all questions you may have.
Great, thank you so much, Mike. We do have one question, and so I'll go ahead and ask that, and then we're going to go on to Rachel so we have time for discussion at the end. But Jeanette Sutton wanted to know, when you were talking about channels, what channel does the internet fall under? Is it traditional?
Yeah, first, hi Jeanette, and great to hear from you. When we look at the internet as a whole, I'm going to go back a few slides here, and we broke it down across a few different elements. So we had social media, and I did track a number of other things here that kind of parallel some of the work you guys actually did, Jeanette, on the WIA study. So I looked at social media, then we looked at things like websites, then we looked at, engaging with blogs, then we looked at, email, then we looked at, emailing websites versus emailing individuals. So we didn't break the internet down as a single category. We broke it down across a number of its constituent pieces, and it was not, none of those constituent pieces were included in traditional media, though I think there's probably a good argument to start putting email in there now. but social media far and away rose to be among the top.
Great, thank you. If we get other questions, I will forward them on, or if we have time for discussion afterwards. So with that, I'm going to ask that you return. Actually, I can go ahead and make Rachel presenter. I don't think, let me know if that's working. Rachel, did you get something? Uh-oh. That doesn't look good. Hang on, I think you're muted, Rachel. There we go. Rachel, did you get something to make yourself?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Perfect. All yours.
Okay. All right. Super. That was a great presentation. Glad to follow it. My name is Rachel Hogan-Carr. I'm Executive Director of Nurture Nature Center. As Elizabeth and Kim introduced, we have done a few studies looking at flood forecasts. And so this presentation is about the process of designing data to communicate risk, specifically looking at flooding forecasts. And for those who are unfamiliar with us, Nurture Nature is a nonprofit based in Easton, Pennsylvania. We've been working for a number of years now on a variety of outreach, education, and social science initiatives about flooding. At the bottom of the screen here, there's a couple of the more recognizable pieces from our Focus on Floods campaign that started us out here in the Delaware River Basin in the 4 states of Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware, where we learned a lot about how the public uses National Weather Service flood forecast tools. And in the years since then, we've sort of served as a mediator, and I put us between the policy experts and the scientific experts who produce the data that goes out related to flooding, and the public audiences who are there to use it and absorb it and make decisions from it. And so our role has been to serve as a go-between between these two audiences and find out the critical information public audiences need to know, and from the public, what is the information they feel they need to know and how should it best be presented. And that's what we're really talking about here, is this social science end of all of this data and how we present data so that it most effectively communicates risk. And these days I feel like in the weather world we hear a lot about this idea of communicating risk. And in this context, what we really mean by that is 2 pretty fundamental things when we're talking about flood forecasts. And what I'm talking about today is simply how can National Weather Service products be easier to understand at the most basic level so that you're looking at a product and you're taking away the right factual information from it. And then secondarily, there's an important element about how can these products better motivate people to take protective actions. So it's one thing to understand your risk and understand what's being told. It's a second to do something about it. And that's what kind of undergirds the studies that we have done is the increasing ability of the National Weather Service to produce tremendous amounts of timely, highly accurate data related to flooding in both riverine and coastal contexts, and then the commensurate other side of the story where people still often don't respond the way that we sometimes think that they might to protect their life and property, despite all of this accurate data. And Gary Zatkowski from the Mount Holly Weather Forecast Office, now retired, was our partner in 2 of these projects, and talks about the fact that the technology has advanced tremendously, and now we need to figure out how to communicate that information so people can take the right action with the time they're given. So we had 3 studies. One was a riverine study beginning in 2012, funded by the Office of Weather and Air Quality. We were one of 4 studies funded in that round looking at extreme weather and decision making. And there we looked at riverine contexts in Easton, Pennsylvania, where we are, and Lambertville, New Jersey, also along the Delaware, also highly flood-prone community, with a little bit more of a rural perspective to it than the more urban Easton. We also had the coastal study that we did in 2014, funded by NOAA Sea Grant and the New Jersey Sea Grant Consortium, and that looked at communities affected by Superstorm Sandy and specifically Ocean and Monmouth counties in New Jersey. And currently we're working on a 3rd one, which is very exciting. We just came back from our 2nd round of focus groups. This is funded through the National Weather Service, and this is looking at the National Ensemble Forecast System called HEFS, Hydrologic Ensemble Forecast System. And so we're doing a study particularly of that tool in the context of other flood forecast tools. So our partner in this work has been East Carolina University. So Nurture Nature Center was the grant recipient for the first two projects. East Carolina ends up the grant recipient for the third one, but in both cases, it's shared leadership on making these projects happen. And what we have done is used a scenario-based approach with focus group participants in these flood-affected communities. In all of them, we have used residential participants as focus group members. In a few of them, we've also held separate groups for emergency managers. But we use a combination of focus group and survey and interview in some cases to get feedback from the participants on a wide range of flood forecast and warning products. We put them in generally a 4 to 7 day scenario that would create a tremendous storm event in the area where they're living. The case that you're seeing here is the flood of record of 1955 coming over the eastern Pennsylvania Lambertville area through a storm that looked very much like Connie and Diane. As an example of how we would create the scenario and mock up tools to show people what that scenario might be like. And during these sessions, which lasted about 2 hours, have about 15 participants each, the participants would provide feedback on the timing of the products, who the information source that they would prefer the products come from, the graphic clarity, how they would share information once they received it, and importantly, as I mentioned, how the products motivate action as they come across. And you can see here a wide range of coastal and riverine flood forecast products that we've looked at over the course of these 3 studies. Importantly, the Advanced Hydrologic Prediction Service hydrograph, significant flood outlooks, hazardous weather outlooks, flood watches and warnings of all kinds, coastal / riverine, emergency briefings, specifically in the coastal context, but again, now currently in our HEFS study, extratropical storm surge, wind speed, and importantly, some uncertainty products, which I will touch upon. The cone makes an appearance in all of our studies as well, although we haven't chosen it as an area for a discrete study because it has been looked at multiple times by others. And the big takeaway that we learned is that design matters. And by design, I mean more than just how the product looks, but I mean the thought that's put into the dissemination, the production of the data, and the graphical design as we would traditionally think about it. There are elements all along this process of gathering and disseminating data to the public that make a big difference in how people respond to the product once they actually see it. We have here a few samples of products I'm going to go into in more depth. Some of the key takeaways, and we're going to get into this design issue a bit more on each of these. One of the key points was that for all the groups, river levels matter. Our first study was riverine, and so it was looking at Easton, PA and Lambertville, New Jersey. In that case, the hydrograph was the most preferred product, the gold star of all the products that the residents used. They had a high level of familiarity with it, but more importantly, they thought that it provided really meaningful information that they wanted. They really wanted the river level right at their doorstep because they could interpret that in a way that could make them decide whether or not to take action. That was not abstract information, that was very concrete, clear information. This was the hydrograph as it looked during one of the presentations, and they thought it was very visually clear, very useful, had great location specificity, and they thought it was just a winner of a product all the way around. And that holds true in all of the groups that we've looked at, that the hydrograph is much beloved. It was less well used in Virginia, West Virginia, and Maryland while we were there, but they still did really appreciate that information. The use of color comes out repeatedly, loudly and clearly as very important across all the products in all 3 studies that we did. And the right color or the wrong color can really make or break whether or not people decide that they understand what's being told to them, whether they'll be willing to invest any more time trying to figure out what's being told to them, and whether they decide to take any action in it. As a result of it. So here was a case of, this is a quantitative precipitation forecast that was shown during our river Reen study, and this is one that the audience had a very loud, palpable, and profound sense of relief when they saw, because they could clearly distinguish the colors. They could quickly identify the red target area as the danger zone, and that they were in it. And so this was motivational to the audience, that they could see this was a place where they were going to take action. So there were other products, however, where the use of color was really a barrier to their understanding. Flood inundation maps, for instance, had some confusing use of blue that caused the participants not to use it as much as they might otherwise. The lack of color or the lack of a detectable font could also be a problem. Here's an example of the Significant River Flood Outlook. This is a product that I love that gives you a 5-day look ahead to the chance that there might be significant river flooding in your area. And this is something that the audiences said they'd love to see, but when presented with a product that showed it to them, they pretty uniformly dislike this product the way that it is. And the reasons are understandable. So the orange area that's there is the area where significant river flooding is considered either possible or likely, depending on that legend. It's really hard to tell. It's not clear why that area is there. They thought that the outline of the orange area, where it's very dark orange, was indicating that there was imminent flooding happening all around the perimeter of that entire area. And that's, of course, not accurate. It's just a function of the shading of the graphic itself. And so and there was also geographic trouble. They couldn't understand where that black line was coming from, and they couldn't understand why the rain was stopping on a straight line. There were so many confusing aspects to this product that although it was providing them the information they thought that they would really like to have, which is the earliest possible heads up, it didn't work for them. And the uncertainty graphics that are produced from the Middle Atlantic River Forecast Center are known as MMEFS. And these are ensemble forecast graphics that show a range of potential outcomes. And these, the first time we tested ensemble graphics was in our first study in 2012. And these were samples of what were shown there. And the takeaway from that first round of focus groups was that absolutely nobody could extract any information from any of these products. The ensembles were very confusing and misleading, and people strongly disliked them and thought they should not even be shown to people like them who didn't understand them, and said maybe for emergency managers, but you should lock them away because they really, really couldn't understand the information. So we spent a lot of time looking at these products, talking with them about things like labeling, use of color, how they might become better, and we began a process of mocking these products up. In all three of the focus groups, all three of the projects that we've done. And then after we get the feedback, we go back and we mock up the products working with our National Weather Service partners who help us. And we go back and we retest the products and see whether or not the changes that have been done make significant improvement. And you can see here an example of a draft mocked up hydrograph. Even though this was beloved, people did take wrong information from it in its original format. On the right, you see the way that we proposed a revision to it. And some of the changes are quite simple, but they were very meaningful in the participants' reaction. We provided a much more complete legend, and this is something that's a takeaway for many of the products. You can see we defined where the action stage, minor flooding, moderate flooding, and so on are. We also changed the shading between the observed and forecast areas on the hydrograph. People were having difficulty understanding that a portion of the hydrograph was showing observed and a portion was showing forecast. We also changed the title of this, as we did with many of the products. So you see the way it was presented on the left has a variety of numbers and letters that don't provide too much meaning to people. But we talked a lot with them about what is this product telling you, and came up with the title Observed and Forecast River Levels. This provides a really quick at-a-glance description for participants of what they're looking at. And also, we redesigned all of the products in a standard formatting that quickly helps people to identify where the source of the data is, in this case, the Delaware River at Easton. We also added here some interactive functionality between this and any watches or warnings that might be in effect. So you see the orange bar at the top that says prepare now. If there were a watch in place, people would be able to click there and get directly to a flood watch. We also presented versions where if there were a warning in place, that bar would turn red and provide people quickly with a heads up that they were in a warning context. This is the significant river flood outlook I mentioned earlier, and I described some of the difficulty people had with it. You can see on the right, the revised version uses a much improved differentiation of zones through the legend there. You can see where there were very similar crosshatch distinctions on the original. On the right, it's quite clear to be able to tell where the flooding is likely, possible, or imminent. We also added geographic specificity, adding town names, because people have difficulty finding themselves, and they weren't able to make sense of it. Oh, one key point is that we also changed the word significant to damaging. Participants gave us feedback, and other social science research has shown that the word significant is oftentimes meaningless to people. And as one of our participants said, my significant could be different than yours. And so we really went with the bent of the impact-based, and you chose the word damaging, because that's what people need to understand. Not so much the size, but the fact that these are going to be damaging river flooding events that are possible, likely, or imminent. In many of the products, we also responded to participants' sense that they would like more text sometimes. Although people prefer a balance of text and graphics, sometimes people said, could you just say it in a sentence? Could you just say what you mean? Could you help us translate this information? And so you'll see a few places here on some of these products where it provides a place for a forecaster to add a note or to summarize or highlight the critical information that is there at the top here. The outlook shows the potential for damaging and dangerous flooding. Here is our uncertainty graphic that I mentioned and showed earlier. The MMEFS bar and whisker on the left is as was originally tested in round 1 to universal dislike. But then in round 2, we went back and we provided them with a much updated version of the same product. We went through the same exact scenario and instead inserted this product into the discussion, and it was much more warmly received. We had a much richer discussion with focus group participants who still struggled in many ways to understand some of the information, but it were very much improved in their ability to describe what the product was trying to tell them. They were able to give us better feedback about how to improve it further because they understood it much more strongly. You can see the significant changes here in the use of a legend down at the bottom describing what the various levels of certainty mean. The use of color to visually represent the level of certainty is very strong in this one. Again, a title change. Instead of calling it the GEFS-based stage simulation expected value plot, which didn't go over so well, we renamed this 7-day river level probabilities, which made it pretty clear. And we worked on that long and hard with the audience, too, about what kind of a title made the most sense for them. Again, there's a place for a forecaster's note. And in many of these products, we created interactivity with the hydrograph because in so many instances, when asked, what would you do when seeing this product, people would say, I'd go check the hydrograph. And so we made those products interact to the degree that we possibly could. The MMEFS has been transitioned as a result of those recommendations that we made, and I'm showing you here quickly the final version. So the version I just showed was the kind we recommended and tested, and then the MARFC, Middle Atlantic River Forecast Center, went out and further focus group or user tested this with their own user groups, some of their professional user groups, to make sure that our recommendations worked for them, and they put into place the version that you see here, which I think was a very excellent rendition of the product, and they say has been very warmly received and is now used by local media outlets, and that the use of this product has gone up tremendously and is used in FEMA briefings and other places ever since the modifications have made it more user-friendly. So it's really wonderful when we're able to work with the partners and make some of these changes transition right into operations. And off to the left, you see a number of recommendations. This is some under Simplify. These are some of the things that the MARFC talked about that they had to do in working with revising this product, is to work on focusing on the primary message, using non-technical language, and being willing to omit some details to balance statistical rigor versus clarity. And that was part of the process that they went through as a result of these changes with us. We also tested emergency briefings, and I'm not going to go through this too much for the sake of time, except to say that through part of the design of the data that I mentioned in the beginning is who's speaking, and it was very critical to participants that the ability to connect to the forecaster, and the emergency briefings allowed for that. And this is a sample of a personal plea that came out during Superstorm Sandy from Gary Zatkowski, where he adopted a very personal tone. And this proved to be very influential to focus group participants who either actually had seen this during the event and were motivated by it, or who responded to it once it was presented to them. Nearly everybody indicated that this was a highly motivational event for them in the course of that storm, because having a connection to the source of the information was very important. NOAA routinely has been found through these focus groups to be the desired source of information, but people also want connection from their local municipal officials and emergency managers. We made similar recommendations for changes to emergency briefings. They should be short, they should be sweet, the same sorts of things that you hear with other areas, but really the focus for people there is on action steps that can be taken. The extratropical surge graphic is another product that we mocked up. You can see the kinds of changes that we made are in line with the way that we made changes to the hydrograph. This does this in a coastal context. I'm going to jump ahead so that we can close up on time to our current study, which is the look at the hydrologic ensemble forecast system. I mentioned that we have been working there in Jefferson County and Frederick County. Here we did a 4-day tropical storm scenario of the kind that they would actually experience there. And here we're really looking at how do residents, emergency managers, and water resource managers best make use of this national tool, HEFS. And so our research questions were, what improvements to the products that are coming out, specifically HEFS, will motivate people? How do these various audiences identify the utility of HEFS? How will they actually use the products? And what are the barriers that each of them identify in understanding and accessing them? And then, as we've done in the past, what modifications to this design will improve the utility? Here's a neat rendering. We just finished our second round of focus groups, so I don't have data from there yet, but you can get a sense from these of the products that we reviewed and how people found the utility. You can see that the 15-day HEFS on the far right, which was the focus of the study, was very, very challenging for some of the residential participants. They did find it to have some potential utility. As you can see, the moderately useful and extremely useful, but some people had a lot of difficulty understanding it. Here's a ranking. The cone was the winner for this group, followed by the hydrograph, which is standard. And again, as was the case with our last ensemble forecast test group, it comes in last for residential audiences in terms of the utility of things that they think that they would use as it was currently presented. Emergency managers, however, have a different perspective and different level of training, and they found the ensemble forecast to be much more useful than the residents did. They used all of the products more heavily than the residents did. They were additionally tested on a 90-day forecast product that was not terribly helpful to them, so I'm not going to talk about that, but if you see that red, you can see that that was not helpful. This was the HEFS that was tested in round 1, and residents found it fairly uniformly confusing, not terribly helpful. When described to them, they liked the idea of the information, but they couldn't make sense of it themselves from the product as it was presented. Emergency managers were much more favorable to it, but still found it a little confusing. Here you see the preliminary revision that we just retested in early April with the audiences, much more warmly received. Again, you can see a distinction made between observed and the forecast period, a much stronger use of color, clear delineation of where the moderate, major, and minor flood levels are, We grayed out on the right-hand side the discharge data. There's, again, the willingness to let go of data that is not tremendously helpful to most people. We kept it on there, but really focused the product on the river level side on the left, which is where people want to be. Again, providing new titling, a standard formatting that clearly identifies for the user the date of the forecast period and the location, Monocacy River near Frederick, Maryland at Interstate 70. And so we got some really great feedback in round 2 from those focus group participants, and we'll be making further revisions to that product as part of our final recommendations. But I wanted to close a little bit with just a side note that I think is very important, that this process of the focus group themselves has a strong impact on the participants. And you can see here for the emergency managers, the kind of impacts, the actions that they planned on doing after attending the session. And the gray is very likely. So they were very likely after this to seek out information from the Weather Service. They were likely to share what they learned with others. They were likely to use uncertainty forecasts in their decision making. So this introduced them to a new tool. Residents similarly had a really strong reaction to being part of the focus groups. And they look, if you see, they have a strong likelihood of sharing what they learned today with others. Throughout the process of doing these focus groups, I've often gotten thank yous from participants who say that they were truly informative and helpful for them. And that's not the goal. They're really feeding us information, but it has a secondary impact, which I think is very important. We'll be compiling our findings, putting together a paper. I've listed here some published articles on the past 2 papers in the next year or so, and doing a lot of dissemination. You'll find more on our website, socialscience.focus, on floods, educational materials, and our past studies there. Welcome to take any questions. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much, Rachel. So I know it is like a minute after 1 o'clock. We don't currently have any questions, although I have a question for you. That is probably you will just have to answer hypothetically. But my question is, of these studies that you've done, how transferable do you think the findings are across the country? I mean, is it so localized that you have to, we'll have to do these for many, many communities, or do you think what you're finding in the Southeast will translate into, the Gulf of Mexico? I know you don't know. I apologize for that.
but your point is an important one, and I think that it is impractical to imagine that you're going to do these in every single community. I do think you'll find regional differences. In communities that have had a lot of riverine flooding, the use of the hydrograph appears higher and stronger because that's the critical tool there. And so you might find more emphasis in one community or another. But over the course of these 3 studies in 3 quite distinct communities, there are very clear trends that begin to emerge about how people make decision making. Everybody needs a greater level of geographic specificity than they've had so far. They need to see their town name said, or else they don't believe it applies to them. Even if the event is happening in the town to the left and the right of them, they'll not believe it's happening to them unless they hear their town name. These kind of trends really do seem to be showing up among the various communities that we see. And I also think this process of testing products with audience and engaging in conversation with audience about the products is something that can be institutionalized within the weather forecast offices as part of their regular outreach. So I think that each region could engage in this process a little bit organically, continually, and learn and build their own knowledge base about what their regional audiences need. And I know the service hydrologists and warning coordination meteorologists and all that already do a lot of that. So I don't think it's something that we have to invest in doing in every single community. The more that we reach, the more we learn.
That's great. Well, if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to email me, elizabeth.roaring@noaa.gov, or Kim or Nancy. Our emails are on the invitation that you got, and we will also send something out to everyone with a link to the recording of this. So I want to thank you both. I think Mike had to take off. He had a meeting. But Rachel, thank you so much for doing this for us. And Kim, thank you for helping us to organize it. So with that, thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.